Welcome to Chapter and Verse. Today, we're taking a deep dive into some, well, pretty challenging arguments about the 20th century. We're looking specifically at Britain's role in the world wars and the legacy of Winston Churchill.
That's right. We'll be exploring a viewpoint that, honestly, cuts against the grain. It suggests Britain didn't have to get involved in World War I or II. And this perspective argues that these wars, far from being necessary triumphs, actually led to the collapse of the British Empire.
And Churchill's role in all this is also put under the microscope.
Yeah, the claim is that he perhaps exaggerated threats, helping to push Britain into wars that this analysis calls unnecessary.
We'll definitely get into the 1939 British guarantee to Poland, which is framed here as a fatal diplomatic mistake.
So this promises some surprising taste, maybe challenging what you, our listeners, might think. It pushes towards a more, shall we say, nationalist, non-interventionist view.
Exactly. A stark contrast to the interventionism we often associate with that time.
So what does all this mean for how we understand history? Let's dive in. Okay, first up, World War I, the Great War. The idea here is it wasn't just devastating, but maybe unnecessary, even called the original catastrophe. That's a heavy claim.
It really is. This perspective sees WWI and WWII less as separate conflicts and more like two parts of one big destructive event. A great civil war of the West, a war that inflicted, mortal wounds on Western civilization itself.
Wow, mortal wounds.
Yeah. Think of someone like George F. Kennan, the American diplomat. He called WWI the original catastrophe, the starting point for so much else. Or the historian Jacques Barzun, who said it was the blow that hurled the modern world on its course of self-destruction. Pretty stark language.
It is. And Britain traditionally had tried to stay out of Europe's fights, right? That whole splendid isolation idea. What happened?
Well, for a long time, Britain saw itself as different, a sea power. Lord Salisbury famously said, "We are fish," meaning, stay out of the continental pond. But things changed. Two big things, really. First, America's economy was booming, challenging Britain's top spot.
Okay.
And second, Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany started building a massive navy. That was seen as a direct challenge to British sea power.
So pressure building.
Definitely. And it pushed Britain towards alliances. There were even secret talks, apparently, between British and French military folks way back in 1906, planning for Britain to jump into a war between France and Germany, sending, 100,000 troops almost immediately. And this wasn't even fully approved by the whole government.
Secret talks. That's
Yeah.
that's quite something. What about the mood in London, the human side of it, as war clouds gathered?
Well, it seems many government ministers were actually against war. They preferred staying neutral. But Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, he had a different feeling. There's this quote from a letter to his wife on July 28, 1914.
What does it say?
He wrote, "Everything tends toward catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that?"
Wow. Geared up and happy. That's jarring.
It is. And this perspective uses that to argue that leaders like Churchill and Sir Edward Grey weren't just reacting to, say, Germany invading Belgium. The argument is they were actively steering Britain towards war. Maybe the real goals were about keeping France strong against Germany and grabbing imperial opportunities.
Even though the troops went straight to France, not really to Belgium initially.
Right, so the justification about Belgium might have been, partly a pretext.
So if Britain's entry turned a European war into a world war, what were the costs for Britain itself, according to this view?
Huge, just devastating. The British Empire lost nearly 1 million people, 921,000 fatalities. It racked up enormous debt. And the real irony, this analysis points out, is that by promoting self-determination for other nations during the war, they accidentally encouraged movements for independence within their own empire.
Yeah.
It kind of backfired, sowing the seeds of its eventual collapse.
A tragic irony indeed. Okay, let's move forward. The analysis argues the peace treaty that ended WWI, the Versailles Treaty, actually caused the next war. How so?
Yeah, instead of creating lasting peace, it's seen as planting the seeds for WWII. Lloyd George, the British PM at the time, even warned about it. He said something like, "Injustice, arrogance, displayed in the hour of triumph will never be forgotten or forgiven."
He saw it coming.
He seemed to. But the French, particularly Georges Clemenceau, were pushing for a really harsh peace. Clemenceau reportedly thought there were 20 million Germans too many. Just a chilling sentiment. The goal was basically to cripple Germany so it could never be a threat again.
So what did that mean in practice? What did Germany lose?
A lot, about 1/10 of its people, 1/8 of its land, and its entire overseas empire. Just gone. Key areas like the port city of Danzig were taken away. They created the Polish corridor, which cut off East Prussia from the rest of Germany,
Right, I remember that from maps.
and put about 1 million Germans under Polish rule, plus massive restrictions on the German military. And then there was the blockade. Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty again after the war, kept it going after the fighting stopped. The aim, quite explicitly, was to starve the whole population into submission.
Starve them after the armistice. That seems incredibly harsh.
It does, and it's presented as part of this effort to break Germany completely.
You mentioned warnings at the time. Were there others besides Lloyd George?
Oh, yes. Many saw this wasn't going to end well. Marshal Foch, the French commander, famously said, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years.
Wow, he called it almost exactly. 20 years later, 1939.
Precisely. And General Smuts from South Africa called the treaty's spirit poisonous revenge. So the argument is, this treaty didn't just punish Germany, it humiliated it, it undermined the new German democracy right from the start, and basically guaranteed another conflict down the line.
Okay, so the stage is set for more trouble. Let's look at the interwar years, and specifically Churchill's role. This analysis seems critical of his actions before WWII as well.
It does, yeah. It paints a picture that's, well, maybe less straightforward than the usual heroic narrative. For instance, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, he pushed for budget cuts, especially to the Navy.
Really? Churchill cutting the Navy? That sounds wrong.
It does seem counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But he backed something called the 10-year rule,
Yeah.
basically assuming no major war for a decade, so slash military spending. He even dismissed the need for a lot of silly little cruisers.
Huh. A big change from his usual stance.
A very big change. And then there's his view on Mussolini in Italy. He actually praised him quite highly for a time. Just before Italy invaded Ethiopia, Churchill called Mussolini so great a man and so wise a leader, partly because he saw fascism as stopping the spread of Bolshevism.
Okay, that's surprising. How did he react when Hitler started breaking the rules, like putting troops back into the Rhineland? That was a direct challenge.
It was a huge gamble by Hitler in 1936, violating treaties. But Churchill's initial reaction, according to this view, was surprisingly, well, muted. He didn't immediately sound the loudest alarms. In fact, the analysis points out that in 1937, he even expressed some admiration for Hitler's patriotic achievement in restoring German pride.
Admiration.
For Hitler. He apparently said something like he hoped Britain would find a similar indomitable leader if it were ever defeated. It's a complex picture, and many British officials at the time apparently felt the public just did not care two hoots about German troops marching into German territory. A failure to see the bigger danger, perhaps.
So the argument is this lack of a strong response, plus France hiding behind its Maginot Line defenses.
Exactly. It basically gave Hitler a green light. Failing to stop him in the Rhineland is called a disaster. It let him build his own fortifications, the West Wall, securing his western border, which then freed him up, to look east and south.
The back door, as the analysis puts it.
Right. And by 1938, people like Lord Halifax, Britain's foreign secretary, were apparently telling Hitler that Britain wouldn't strongly object to, say, reclaiming German-speaking areas in Austria or Czechoslovakia as long as it was peaceful.
Sending mixed signals, at best.
Or maybe clear signals that Britain wasn't ready to fight over those issues.
What about the U.S. during this time, like during the Munich crisis? Were they offering support to Britain and France?
Not at all. This perspective stresses America's isolationism. President Roosevelt made it crystal clear in September 1938. He said anyone who count on the assured aid of the United States in case of a war in Europe are totally mistaken. Basically, you're on your own.
Which must have really weakened Britain and France's position when dealing with Hitler.
Absolutely. No backup coming from across the Atlantic.
Okay, this leads us directly to March 1939 and the British guarantee to Poland. This analysis calls it a fatal diplomatic mistake. Why?
It's presented as a really sudden, almost impulsive move, possibly triggered by a shaky intelligence report from Romania, the Talia scare, about imminent German action, which might have been exaggerated. The guarantee is described as this reckless and irrational determination to resist Hitler at the next opportunity, no matter the cost or the strategic logic.
Reckless. But wasn't it meant to stop Hitler, to deter him?
Well, the argument is that it completely failed as a deterrent. Hitler wasn't deterred. Instead, it actually made the Poles less willing to negotiate with Germany over issues like Danzig or the corridor. They felt they had Britain's backing, so why compromise?
The Lloyd George you mentioned was critical.
Very critical. He called it a frightful gamble, even the maddest single action this country has ever taken. He compared it to Britain guaranteeing Mexico against the U.S. strategically impossible to actually enforce.
A guarantee you can't back up.
Exactly. And the analysis adds another layer, suggesting the Polish government itself at the time was undemocratic and anti-Semitic, questioning the clear moral case for Britain going to war for them.
So, if the guarantee was such a mistake, what was the alternative? What else could Britain have done, according to this viewpoint?
Yeah, this is where the argument gets really controversial, maybe even cynical. It suggests that without the guarantee, Hitler would likely have focused eastward, following his plan outlined in Mein Kampf, attack the Soviet Union.
Let the Nazis and Soviets fight it out.
Essentially, yes. Let the world's two great dictatorships fight each other to a frazzle. The thinking is this might have weakened both regimes, Nazism and Bolshevism, possibly leading to a better outcome for the West and saving Western lives.
That's a stark what-if, trading Poland's fate for a potentially larger strategic gain.
It's a very cold calculation, presented as a missed opportunity to avoid Britain getting dragged into another catastrophic war.
And the tragic outcome for Poland itself is highlighted.
Absolutely. The analysis draws a painful contrast. Prague, the Czech capital betrayed at Munich, actually survived the war relatively intact. But Warsaw, the Polish capital that Britain supposedly saved by going to war,
It was utterly destroyed.
reduced to rubble. The Poles, who trusted the guarantee, ended up with, quote, abandonment and half a century of Nazi and Soviet barbarism. A devastating outcome.
Okay, let's pull these threads together. How does all this reevaluation impact the legacy of Winston Churchill? The figure we usually see is Britain's heroic wartime leader.
Well, the analysis acknowledges his heroic leadership during the war. It's not really disputed. But it argues that as a statesman, judged by the long-term results of his actions, he ultimately failed. And it uses Churchill's own words against him. Post-war, he apparently reflected, historians are apt to judge war ministers less by the victories than by the political results. Judged by that standard, I'm not sure that I shall be held to have done very well.
He had his own doubts then. What specific failures does this critique focus on?
Several areas. First, his military strategy, particularly early on. It points to things like the Antwerp intervention in WWII or the Norway campaign in WWII seen as costly blunders. Also, his initial failure to grasp the importance of submarines and air power. The analysis calls him horribly wrong on that, citing British aircraft carriers getting sunk or the reliance on outdated biplanes like those that crippled Bismarck.
Okay, strategic missteps. What else?
Questions about the moral means he employed. It brings up his support back in the 1920s for using poison gas against what he called uncivilized tribes in Iraq.
Right, that's often cited.
And then during WWII, his authorization of the bombing campaign against German cities, described here as an absolutely devastating, exterminating attack.
Yeah.
This terror bombing, the analysis argues, deliberately targeted civilians and broke fundamental rules of warfare, raising serious ethical questions.
Just strategy and morality. Anything else?
Yes, his relationship with the U.S. The critique argues he was perhaps too deferential, leading to an abasement of Britain before the United States. Especially regarding the terms of Lend-Lease, the wartime aid program, Britain essentially had to mortgage its future, selling off assets. This view suggests Churchill didn't fully grasp America's own ambitions, which were often at odds with preserving the British Empire.
He maybe trusted this special relationship too much.
Or didn't see how the power dynamic was shifting so decisively. And finally, it all comes back to the empire's collapse. The core argument is that Britain's choice to intervene in these two massive civil wars of the West was the primary cause of its bankruptcy and the loss of its empire, leaving Britain a much diminished power on the world stage.
So a fundamentally tragic view of Britain's 20th century and Churchill's role within it. Well, that was certainly a deep dive. We've explored a perspective that really challenges many common assumptions about the world wars and British history.
It's definitely thought-provoking. The consistent thread is this argument for non-interventionism, that focusing purely on national interest, avoiding these huge ideological crusades, might have saved the British Empire and prevented immense suffering.
It's a powerful counter-narrative.
It is, and it reminds us that history isn't simple. Decisions have long, often unforeseen consequences. What looks like a victory or a necessary action at the time can look very different decades later.
It forces us to look beyond just the wartime heroism and consider the long-term strategic outcomes.
Exactly, and maybe it leaves you, the listener, with a question to ponder. How should nations balance moral arguments, like fighting tyranny, with the hard realities of strategy and national interest? What can this specific critical look at Britain's past teach us about the real costs and maybe the potential benefits of choosing intervention versus choosing restraint? It's a dilemma that hasn't gone away.
A crucial question indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.